Hi, and welcome to The Existential Coach. In this episode, titled Politics Without Politics, I want to explore the way in which political ideology is really feeding a form of desire, a need of some kind that serves its own purpose, that's in a sense consuming itself and ultimately moves towards no specific end. Now, recently there was the election in Alberta. I'm in Canada. And I'm not going to talk about the parties or any of these kinds of things. But what I am going to talk about is the overall dynamics of politics and how there is a politic without politic that is really not about the party lines, whatever party you vote for or perhaps are a member of, and instead to explore the way in which we relate to these body politic or these political parties as a form of shaping our identity. So perhaps first we should just explore the idea of identity. Now this has come up throughout the podcast in many different ways. And I think the ongoing theme is identity is something and self is something that is created within the relationships. So we're born into a time, into a culture, we speak a certain language. And this shapes what our reality is, what our identity is, what our sense of self is. And in addition to shaping this reality, there are these relationships or these interpersonal dynamics which shape our experience. So if we think of the way in which we feel perhaps resistance to somebody versus the way in which we may feel drawn to somebody, we can say that there was, in whatever language we want to use, a boundary of some kind where we felt that we wanted to push away from that person versus we felt drawn to that person. And that's a way of exploring how we connect with others and how we push away from others. The important point here is that this creates a sense of identity, a sense of self, a kind of border, if you will. Like a country has a border. And if that border becomes fluid, we become unclear on where our country ends. And if that border becomes, let's say, porous, then things can flow in and out of that border or across that border in a way that can undermine our sense of self as we have constructed it, which is to say, we have a self that is formed in a way that requires a certain amount of rigidity and a certain amount of fluidity. So, in political terms, if we were to say, and again, this is not about the party or the political place we find ourselves or try and locate ourselves on the spectrum of politic. Rather, it is about understanding and exploring that point at which we feel drawn to or pushed away from. And so in this way, can we talk about politics without politics? Can we talk about the dynamic of being for or against a certain individual, perhaps the leader of a party or a member of a party, or a certain group, the party itself, or affiliates within that group, within that party? All of this gets into the way in which we understand ourselves in the world. And the question we then ask, or we may then ask, is, can I, if only to explore the possibility, shift my way of understanding this dynamic of accepting or resisting these voices, these experiences? So let's say I'm not going to use left or right. I'm going to say political A and political B. Let's say I'm a member of political A group. And I call it political A group because it's my favorite group. That's why I've designated it the first letter in the alphabet. But then something comes along and I start to get a sense that there's this political B group. Well, let's notice two things that are going on. The first is, what makes political A group? Well, it's the subsequent letters in the alphabet, the B group, C group, D group, E group, so on and so forth. In other words, if you take away the hierarchical structure, then what is the political ideology that I have espoused as being important to me? How do I understand it has value if I don't have something in opposition to? So this is where we get into a kind of master-slave or master-servant dialectical. And what happens is this form of understanding is predicated on the notion, you could say predicated on the assumption, that by being in a dominant position, I am able to remove myself in some way from the other, right? The other lesser than models. However, like the example of A being the first in the alphabet and followed by B, C, and so on, really it's an entirely dependent, which means it's not the case that A, in this example, is the master. It's actually the case that A is the servant. And this is where we start to shift our understanding of how, when we remove the politics from politics and we look at the dynamic of the master-servant, master-slave dialectical, we see the way in which the kind of sense of power that we think we are acquiring, that we think we even have, the status that we think guarantees us a sense of identity, a sense of self, is actually dependent, hence in servant to, you could say, awkwardly, albeit, you could say that it is a servant to this higher power, this greater power, which is the structure which orders the universe, our universe. And this is where the question of ideology starts to come in. And say, okay, well, how does ideology come into this? If I've set out to be a part of the political A group, and I think it's the best group, the most correct, the most righteous, and so on and so forth, and the argument here is that actually renders me in service to or enslaved to this broader power, how is it the case that ideology in and of itself is going to, in some way, manage or contextualize this experience? Because if we think about what ideology is doing, is it's fundamentally supplanting the experience of being the servant, right? It's a kind of illusion. And this is why ideology feeds only itself. So clearly, I'm in a dependent situation if the way in which my political group is defined is in opposition to other groups, right? I think it's fair to say that I am then defined by my opposition, which means I am then dependent on those others. Yet I need to believe that I'm in control. What brings that into focus for me, in other words, what makes it believable to me that this myth of being in control is a truism, is the ideological story that frames my plight, my narrative, my sense of the sense of history, even how I interpret facts. Could be scientific facts, can be, doesn't matter what they are, but it frames, it's like a pair of glasses that bring certain things into focus while leaving other things out of focus. So all of this is because I need to rationalize the fact that I am actually in servant to this larger context, yet I need to have dominion over this larger context. So here we are thinking about politics without politics, yet the dynamics that are implicit in this form of understanding are so clearly defined in our day-to-day experience. So let's take the example of going to a grocery store. You're you're going to the grocery store and you're driving your car and you're about to pull into a parking spot and somebody takes your spot. And you get really upset at this person. Now, you don't do anything. You don't swear at them or crash your car into the back of them or whatever you're doing. But you, in your mind, tell yourself, well, I could do all of these different things and I would be so right in doing that because they are such a bad person for cutting me off. Let's say you make it into the grocery store and you notice that all the prices are way higher. And you think, this is so unfair that people who, corporations and large businesses who have these grocery stores are clearly price gouging. And you tell yourself all of these different things that are going to undermine, in your mind, only in your mind, undermine the way in which these people are ripping you off, quote unquote, ripping you off. Of course, you buy whatever you buy. Maybe there's one or two things you decide to rebel against and not buy, or you switch certain projects. But still, you buy your groceries, you put them in your cart, and you go up to the front, and you pay for them, and you leave. You get back in your car, and you drive home. In this example, you've had two rebellions, all internal, all as a way to try and offset the fact that you feel in those moments like you are a servant to somebody else's power, be it the person who cuts you off and parks their car, or the grocery store that is gouging, price gouging and giving you all sorts of anxiety because you're worried about maybe not being able to afford not only groceries but other things and feeling stretched, and that can obviously impact how you're feeling about your status. Am I stable enough? Can I provide? Can I take care of myself? Can I take care of my family? And so that can lead to feelings of shame, guilt, anger, frustration, so on. But what's the point here is those two internal forms of liberating oneself were through creating the fiction of power in a situation where the person was clearly having the reality experience of being the servant. And similarly in politics, the idea of overcoming another party or another political ideology, be it an individual or a group, is based upon the implicit narrative that we create for ourselves that then liberates us from this servant position or the slave position and gives us a way to fight back against, quote unquote, the enemy, right? The other. Now, the point here to explore, and this is why I want to talk about politics without politics, is because once you start taking away the subjects, in this case, a political group, right, left, A, B, whatever it is, and we start to look just at the dynamics and the way in which, like with the example of going to the grocery store where we pull into the parking spot, we go through our own kind of rebalancing through the narrative of, I could have done something to this person who did this mean thing to me. Similarly, when we go into the store and we're feeling that we've experienced this price gouging, that I could have done something to fight back. These ways of understanding our existence can be manipulated. So somebody can come in and say, I know that dynamic. I know that you have a fantasy of overcoming your own servitude. I know what that's like. I hear you. I get you. I am on your side. And all of a sudden, these voices that were inside of us that we didn't really feel were being heard, that we are speaking within ourselves, it's as if somebody hears us. It's as if all of a sudden the cries that we had in the parking lot and the cries that we had in the grocery store are being heard. We feel vindicated. We feel connected to something greater than ourselves. We feel that we are no longer alone, that we are no longer isolated and alienated in a world that is just heaping stuff on us, cutting us off at the grocery store, price gouging us at the grocery store, and any number of examples that each one of us have in our day-to-day routine, our day-to-day experience of dealing with the feeling of shame, the feeling of humiliation, the feeling of being negated, the feeling of being unheard. And we engage in our internal kind of mythological narrative acts of liberating ourselves from being the servant. Yet, We are completely dependent. Again, the power that we seek, the ideological frame that we use, is consumptive of itself. This means that, and this is pretty obvious when you see political back and forth, but other forms of back and forth, is it never seems to address any problem. And people will often say nothing will change and politicians will always lie and all these kinds of things. Yet they don't actually believe that. They say it because at the end of the day, what's going on for that person when they're saying that politicians always lie, they're saying that this dynamic won't change. And the fact that it won't change means we need to keep up these kinds of narratives, the sense of futility, the sense of frustration, the sense of alienation, which reflects our own experience. It reflects the way in which we are feeling. It's like standing in front of a mirror and saying, I am seeing myself in this way, and then we see ourselves in that way. It's an emulation of experience. The fact that politicians lie or trick us or do all of these different things speak to the fact that we are, in effect, lying and tricking ourselves. How so? Well, if we are engaged in a process of trying to fulfill our own fantasies, that we have a power that we do not have, then we are lying from the beginning. Now, that might sound kind of harsh, and hopefully I'll be able to get to a point where it'll seem less harsh and make more sense. But for now, I'll use this dramatic language of saying we're lying to ourselves. Now, I'm not saying that we shouldn't lie to ourselves. I'm saying that we are necessarily lying to ourselves, and we have learned to lie to ourselves, like earlier when I was talking about the idea of constructing self, constructing identity, the boundaries of external, internal, the analogy to a border, for example, that we are lying to ourselves as a way to construct some form of self that seems to be the self that can exist. This is the person I can be within the society, and it needs to cohere within society. So if everybody was just doing their own thing in their own way, or everybody was just following without thinking, there would be this sense of adherence to some form of existence, whether it's totally individual or totally collective, yet it would not in any way be representative of the authoring of one's voice, right? So going back to the parking lot and the grocery store analogy, there was an emulation of a voice, a trying to rebel. But notice that the way in which it was portrayed, the kind of vernacular of it, the idiom of that story came through the sense of I need to conquer somebody else. Not I need to talk to that person, or not I need to just not think about it and park in another spot. Not I need to talk to my local MP or MPP or wherever country you are, the political figures. Not that I need to challenge these things. I need to pretend that I have overcome something without actually overcoming it. This is the key. If we are imagining that we are overcoming, that we are triumphing over the person who cut us off, or the grocery store that's price gouging, then what we want is a political system, or I shouldn't say what we want. What mirrors that is a political system that allows us to stay within that form of denial. Now, if we think back to this idea of politics without politics, and we think about the self and what constructs the self, and then we think about the dynamics of self in the world, i.e. our relationships, then does it start to become a little clearer that we're in these contingent relationships with people? We're engaging in these relationships in a variety of different contexts. Going to the grocery store is just one, but it can be anything. And within that, we are feeling harmed or hurt. There's a rupture. And then we seek to repair, which we do internally through some form of fantasy. And so the fantasy becomes the kind of perversion. And the perverted idea here is that the fantasy can correct the reality of the situation. So, for example, the collective perversion is that electing people will just lead to everything being better. We all know that's not going to happen, right? We've already said that people have said time and time again, politicians lie and nothing will change and blah, blah, blah. Yet we engage in that fallacy. And some people say, well, I don't know who to vote for, so I'm not going to vote. And it's almost as if they're making the statement of, this is me saying, I disregard this system. I am standing up by not standing up. Again, this all engages a form of fantasy that the servant has more power, that we can. It's like the armchair quarterback idea, where you can sit in a position on the outside and say what somebody else should and shouldn't do while not actually engaging in the process. And this becomes the lying portion that I was saying earlier, the lying concept that I was saying earlier. And this idea is we're lying as a way to protect against this feeling that our borders are being overwhelmed. And so remember I was saying lying sounds dramatic and hopefully it'll become clearer. This is the part where it becomes clear. I'm not saying lying as a judgment. To the contrary, I'm saying lying as a way to try and understand and protect an identity within an environment that is dangerous. There's simply no question that people are feeling that the world we are living in is dangerous. There's simply no question that people are feeling that the world we are living in is not stable. Now, what that means is we are in some form of triggered, some form of volatile, some form of uncertainty. And so this triggered, volatile, uncertain experience is manifesting in a form of confusion that means we need to regulate that confusion or address that confusion through some form of fantasy. And like the fantasy we have in the grocery store parking lot or at the grocery store, this fantasy gives us an illusion that we have more power than we have. However, from an existential perspective, and this will definitely sound harsh, the universe does not care about you. And what that means is that it's so hard to reconcile that we are at once driving towards life, seeking meaning, seeking purpose, seeking agency, seeking to express, seeking to live. And at the same time, we are pushed up against nothingness. And as such, the creation of meaning, the creation of a sense of purpose, a sense of direction, a sense of community, a sense of all of these different things is a form of imagination. We have to co-create and then construct through that which we have imagined a sense of community. Yet, when it falls apart and we are time and time again pushed back into a feeling that we are not connected, we are isolated, the meaning that we sought is not being recognized, we are unheard, we are unseen. The safety that we seek to feel like our fundamental needs will always be valued no matter what does not exist. The key pillars of existentialism are wobbly, to put it mildly. So that sense of meaning and purpose, that sense of change, death, the sense of alienation and isolation, the underlying angst and the anxiety that comes from this uncertainty are operating in a way that crosses over many of our thresholds of tolerance. And so what this does is it creates this experience of being overwhelmed. And when we are feeling overwhelmed, we seek some kind of fantastical answer to the solution. Yet we know it's a perversion unconsciously. We know that because, as we said, people say all the time, politicians won't change, things won't change, everybody's lying, all the rest of it. So we are saying this, yet we do it. Even when we're not voting or saying, well, I'm not going to bother, there's no point. That is voting, right? It's not taking a ballot, but it's somebody in their reality or their fantastical reality saying, this is the way I am getting power back. And this goes underneath this idea of the politics without politics. And it gets into the idea of idealizations as feeding upon themselves or the way in which ideologies are self-consuming. So these idealizations of what is good, these ideologies of what is right, what is righteous, these things form and shape a kind of fantasy. Now, we then group with other people to talk about what these fantasies are and to have a coherence or a sustainability or a kind of choir or chorus of voices that say, yes, I recognize you saying X. And that becomes a group that can then fight together. What's happening as a form of community is being created, and it is fighting against the cause, which gives it a sense of, what are all those shaky pillars? Well, community, meaning, fighting against change, creating meaning, not feeling alienated, hence feeling connected, taking the angst of one's existential crisis, hence being pushed up against the experience of nothingness, that the universe doesn't care about you, and they're saying, it does matter, this is our community, this is our voice, this is what we're doing. In other words, it fights against the existential crisis that a person and group of people are having. And so the politics without politics creates a kind of emptiness that exposes how these are, in my view anyway, the dynamics that are going on when the political or religious or whatever it is rhetoric is being espoused. It's not the concepts, and I think this is one of the failings that comes up a lot, not only when we talk about politics, but when we talk about, you could say, a couple in couples therapy or an individual when they're talking about relationships, a coworker and so on, is we get lost in the idea that we're talking about the thing, the object, and we step away from and conceal the fact that there's a dynamic. And that dynamic is fundamentally concealing an emotion. And so all of what I'm saying can be thought of as we are moving from the object reality of voting this way or that way, but it could be anything, to the dynamic that's going on between people. And all of those are above or concealing or protecting the underlying feeling, which I am putting forth is a sense that we are not safe. We are not connected. There is no real plan. We don't really know. The universe does not care about us. And that scares us. And so I wonder if a part of peeling back this idea of politics without politics is not about saying we shouldn't have politicians or we shouldn't have political discussion. Quite to the contrary. It's recognizing that underneath all of the, in a sense, objective conversations that we're having about going to the grocery store, getting in line, and, being cut off or price gouging, taps into a fundamental feeling. And if we could say, I feel afraid, I feel lost, I feel unheard. And if we were able to say that, could we actually start to move away from the servant position that we have created into the master position, not in a hierarchical sense, but of actually speaking what we are without thinking in terms of the opposition that defines us? In other words, can we speak without seeking to have an affirmation through conflict, through denial? So, something to think about, this idea of how we can move beyond the politics of the politics and start to look into different ways of understanding and dropping down to look into these experiences, these felt experiences, and then speak honestly from those places. Thanks a lot. Bye for now.